March 3, 1943, 10 a.m. Huon Gulf, New Guinea. On board the Japanese destroyer Yuki Kaz, officers stared in disbelief at a formation of 12 twin-engine American bombers advancing toward their convoy. The planes flew at an astonishingly low altitude, skimming just above the ocean, their propellers churning the surface into frothy trails. Through binoculars, the crew could barely grasp what they were seeing. American aircraft attacking at nearly mast height, a method that violated every established principle of naval warfare at the time. Within the next quarter hour, these observers would witness the near-total destruction of Japanese naval capability in the southwestern Pacific. 8 transport ships carrying a total of 6,900 troops, vital reinforcements for New Guinea, would be engulfed in flames. 4 of the Japanese destroyers, seasoned veterans that had escorted convoys across the Pacific since the attack on Pearl Harbor, would be irreparably damaged. Doctrines the Imperial Japanese Navy had relied on for air-sea combat would be obliterated, along with 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors sinking into the Bismarck Sea. Unknown to the Japanese, these were no conventional bombers. The planes were B-25 Mitchells, retrofitted into formidable gunships by the unconventional engineer Paul Pappy gun. Each aircraft was armed with 850 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, allowing them to attack with direct, sustained fire rather than rely solely on bombs. The upcoming engagement, later known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, would expose the revolutionary potential of this American innovation. Bombers that could strafe ships at sea level while also skipping bombs across the water's surface, essentially blending the roles of artillery and air attack. The convoy, which had left the port of Rabaul shortly after midnight on March 1, 1943, represented Japan's final large-scale attempts to reinforce their positions in New Guinea by sea. The reinforcements were urgently needed by General Hoshi Imamura's 8th Area Army to maintain control of the island, a critical outpost safeguarding the southern edge of the Japanese Empire. The escort force, commanded by Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, consisted of 8 of the Imperial Navy's most experienced destroyers: Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yuki Kaz, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo. These warships formed a defensive perimeter around 8 transport vessels: Ayamaru, Kembaru, Kyokuzanmaru, Awawamaru, Shinaimaru, Taimaru, Teiyonmaru, and the naval auxiliary Nojima. Together they carried the 51st Division, approximately 6,900 elite soldiers, as well as critical supplies and ammunition intended to sustain the garrison for an extended period. The convoy's departure had been carefully orchestrated. Japanese meteorologists had forecast a series of storms over the following 3 days, believing the inclement weather would shield the fleet from American reconnaissance planes. However, this tactical calculation would prove disastrously inadequate against the innovative approach of the B-25 attack teams, whose tactics defied all expectations and conventional Japanese planning. In the early months of 1943, around 100 Japanese Zero fighters stationed across bases in New Britain and New Guinea were tasked with maintaining a continuous aerial shield. Their flight path traced the northern shoreline of New Britain, a deliberate tactic aimed at limiting the time they spent over open waters and thus reducing their vulnerability. Captain Tomichi Ha, commander of the destroyer Yuki Kaze and later the author of Japanese Destroyer Captain, had recently observed unsettling shifts in American air strategies. Bombers were flying at unusually low altitudes, and their aircraft had been modified in ways he had not seen before. Despite these warnings, higher-ranking officers largely disregarded such reports, attributing the changes to reckless experimentation born from American desperation. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, a profound evolution in aerial combat was quietly unfolding in the workshops of Port Moresby and Townsville. Since August 1942, Major Paul Papigun, a former naval aviator reassigned to the Army Air Forces, had been overhauling medium bombers, turning them into specialized strike platforms unlike anything previously deployed. The modifications were driven by necessity. Conventional high-altitude bombing against moving ships proved almost futile, with hit probabilities often falling below 1%. From altitudes of 10,000 feet, even skilled bombardiers struggled to strike maneuvering vessels, which could easily spot incoming ordnance and adjust course accordingly. Additionally, anti-aircraft defenses were particularly effective against attacks from medium altitudes. A radical solution was required. Gunn's approach involved retrofitting B-25 bombers with multiple 250 caliber machine guns, repurposing components salvaged from wrecked fighters. The bombardier's glassed-in nose was replaced with a reinforced metal compartment housing 4 forward-firing guns, and another set of 4 guns was installed in pods beneath the cockpit. This configuration enabled each bomber to unleash nearly 6,800 rounds per minute of armor-piercing ammunition at speeds exceeding 2,900 feet per second. Meanwhile, Major Ed Lana's 90th Bomb Squadron, part of the 3rd Bomb Group, had dedicated weeks to refining skip bombing tactics. These crews approached targets at heights of 200 feet or less, releasing 500-pound bombs equipped with timed fuses designed to allow the ordnance to bounce across the water's surface before striking ships. The delay was calibrated to 4 to 5 seconds, providing enough time for the aircraft to escape the ensuing explosion. Practice runs were conducted using the wreck of the SS Pruth in Port Moresby Harbour, with crews repeating the procedure until hits became reliably accurate. Through iterative testing, optimal parameters were established: altitudes between 200 and 250 feet, speeds of 200 to 250 miles per hour, and bomb release points between 60 and 100 feet from the intended target. On the morning of March 2 Bond, the convoy's protective cloud cover began to dissipate earlier than expected. At 10 a.m., a B-24 Liberator on reconnaissance identified the ships through a break in the clouds. Within hours, 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group took to the skies from Port Moresby. The B-17 seconds executed a higher altitude attack than the skip bombers, but still descended to levels lower than usual for strategic bombing, dropping 1,000-pound demolition bombs to bracket the convoy. At approximately 2:45 p.m., the transport ship Kyoko Maru suffered direct hits to its forward cargo sections. Flames quickly engulfed ammunition stores, compelling the crew to abandon the vessel. Rescue operations were swift. Roughly 900 soldiers were evacuated from the blazing transports and ferried to the nearby destroyers Yukiazi and Asagumo. The coordinated use of innovative low-level bombing and concentrated firepower marked a turning point in the Pacific theater, demonstrating the lethal effectiveness of combining tactical ingenuity with aircraft modifications tailored to specific operational challenges. 2 destroyers, heavily burdened with personnel, surged forward at maximum speed to deliver their human cargo before rejoining the main convoy in the early hours of March 3. This urgent maneuver successfully rescued those aboard but came at the cost of reducing the convoy's defensive capacity during a highly vulnerable period. The Japanese forces, however, were unaware that the previous day's B-7 attack had not been a full assault but a calculated probe. Its purpose was to assess the convoy's defensive response and disrupt the formation in preparation for a much larger offensive. Allied strategists had intentionally begun with high-altitude bombing runs to measure the effectiveness of anti-aircraft defenses while simultaneously compelling the convoy to scatter, weakening its protective structure. As March 3 began, the skies over the Huang Gulf were remarkably clear conditions that would prove catastrophic for the Japanese. During the night, the convoy had navigated around the Huan Peninsula and now lay exposed in open waters, only approximately 80 miles from Lille. Safety seemed nearly within reach, but danger approached quickly. At 7:55 a.m., Japanese lookouts spotted the first wave of enemy aircraft approaching from the south. Unlike the B-7 bombers of the previous day, these planes maintained an extremely low altitude, skimming just above the sea, their propellers kicking up spray from the waves. As the aircraft closed within roughly 2,000 yards, streams of tracer rounds erupted from their noses, converging on the convoy's anti-aircraft positions. Japanese gunners attempting to operate their weapons were swiftly incapacitated, while those seeking cover were unable to mount any defense. Following the strafing B-25 seconds, fighters from the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 30 Squadron joined the assault. Armed with 420mm cannons and D-303 caliber machine guns, these aircraft added a devastating layer of firepower. The coordinated attacks by American and Australian forces overwhelmed the convoy's anti-aircraft defenses, leaving ships exposed. At exactly 10 a.m., Major Ed Lana led a formation of 12 B-25 bombers from the 91st Bomb Squadron on their precision attack. Flying in groups of 3 at an altitude of just 200 feet and speeds approaching 250 m/5, they descended directly upon the convoy. Months of preparation and practice culminated in this moment. The lead bomber released its bomb approximately 300 yards from the transport Shinimaru. The bomb skipped across the water twice before striking the hull near the waterline. Its delayed detonation occurred 4 to 5 seconds later inside the cargo hold, tearing the vessel apart from within. Meanwhile, the transport Kembaru, carrying barrels of aviation fuel, was struck by a skip bomb amid other ships. The resulting explosion ignited the fuel, creating a fireball that soared 500 feet into the air, disintegrating the vessel almost instantly and leaving behind smoldering wreckage. The AL Maru endured multiple direct impacts in rapid succession, her hull splitting open like a can. The AL Maru, attempting evasive maneuvers to escape the bombers, was hit by bombs from 2 separate B-25 seconds, demonstrating the relentless precision and destructive force of the coordinated air assault. The destroyer's hull fractured under successive explosions, causing it to collapse and sink within minutes. Under the command of Captain Yasuo's, the Asashio maneuvered to shield the transport ships from the aerial assault. Almost immediately, 3 B-25 bombers encircled her. Skip bombs struck directly into the engine compartments, while a hail of machine gun fire swept the decks, leaving them devoid of any personnel. Immobilized and engulfed in flames, the vessel became a static target for subsequent waves of attack. By 10:15 a.m., precisely 15 minutes after Major Lana deployed her first bomb, 7 of the 8 transport ships were either sinking or had already gone under. The Asashio, along with destroyers Arashio and Tokitsukas, sustained fatal damage. The Shirayuki would eventually succumb later in the day. The convoy had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting unit. The carnage extended beyond the destruction of the vessels. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many unable to swim, were thrown into the oil-slicked waters of the Huang Gulf. Survivors faced a grim board New Guinea's coast through waters teeming with sharks and treacherous currents, or cling to floating wreckage in the hope of rescue. The Shikinami, one of the few remaining operational destroyers, began a desperate effort to recover those stranded at sea. Captain Masamichi Ueno's crew worked tirelessly, hauling approximately 300 men aboard within the first hour. However, the reprieve was short-lived. American aircraft returned on follow-up sorties on March 4th, targeting lifeboats and rafts. Concentrated machine gun fire churned the sea into froth, while inflatable rafts were torn apart. PT boats joined the effort, intercepting survivors to prevent Japanese troops from reinforcing the garrison at Leh. For the Japanese military personnel who survived to observe the attack, the assault exposed a stark reality. The Americans had developed weapons and tactics that had no precedent in Japanese military planning. The skip bombing method, designed and refined within a few months, left the Japanese fleet without effective countermeasures. Anti-aircraft guns could not depress sufficiently to strike aircraft flying at mast level, and torpedoes were ineffective against aerial targets. Conventional anti-aircraft doctrine was rendered obsolete. The firepower of the B-25 bombers was especially alarming. While Japanese fighters were typically armed with 2 7.7mm machine guns, sometimes supplemented by 20mm cannons, each B-25 carried the equivalent firepower of multiple fighters up to 850 caliber machine guns, all focused forward and controlled by a single gunner. Equally significant was the precision and coordination of the American attacks, which compounded the destructive impact on the Japanese convoy. The assault brought together an extraordinary coalition of air forces: American B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs from the 3rd Attack Group, and Australian Boomerang. The operation exemplified seamless coordination, as pilots and crews maintained constant communication, adjusting their strategies instantly in response to incoming radio updates and the evolving battlefield. As darkness fell on March 3, the Japanese destroyers that had survived the initial onslaught returned to the site of the engagement, desperately searching for any signs of their comrades. What they encountered instead was a horrifying tableau: floating wreckage, scattered lifeless bodies, and oil igniting across the surface of the Bismarck Sea. The destroyer Hatsuyuki, arriving from Kavieng with additional fuel, enabled search and rescue efforts to continue well into the night. By the end of these operations, roughly 2,700 men were rescued and transported back to Rabaul, while another 1,200, including those who had been unloaded before the main attack, eventually reached Lille. Out of 6,900 soldiers who had embarked from Rabaul with the expectation of reinforcing New Guinea, 2,890 had perished. The 51st Division, which had been counted on to strengthen Japanese positions, effectively ceased to exist as a combat-ready unit without ever engaging the enemy in a meaningful battle. All supplies intended to sustain Japanese operations for months' ammunition, food, medical provisions, and equipment had been lost with the transports. Even aviation fuel aboard the Kembaru, meant to support Japanese aircraft, had spilled into the sea, leaving nothing to keep their planes operational. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the report aboard the battleship Musashi anchored at Truk, he remained silent for a prolonged period. The consequences were unmistakable. Japan could no longer rely on surface convoys to reinforce its garrisons within range of Allied air power. This marked a decisive turning point in Pacific warfare. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not merely a tactical defeat, it represented a strategic transformation. From this point forward, Japanese commanders recognized that any attempt to transport troops or supplies by surface ships under the threat of Allied air patrols would be suicidal. General Hitoshi Imamura personally flew to Tokyo to brief the Imperial General Headquarters, presenting clear evidence that American air capabilities had surpassed Japan's capacity to respond effectively. In a 6-hour session, he detailed how U.S. air forces were not simply increasing in number, they were redefining aerial combat itself. On March 25, 1943, a Central Army-Navy agreement for operations in the Southwest Pacific designated New Guinea as the highest operational priority over the Solomon Islands campaign. Yet, with surface reinforcements now impossible, this directive offered little practical advantage. Japanese forces in New Guinea faced a campaign with minimal hope for resupply or substantial reinforcement, effectively isolating them. For the United States, the outcome validated years of tactical innovation. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had transformed his units from standard bombing squadrons into an unprecedented aerial force capable of projecting control over maritime regions without relying on a fleet of ships. Major Ed Lana, leading the 91st Squadron in the Skip bombing assault, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his exceptional command, with official recognition emphasizing the decisive impact of his leadership in annihilating the convoy. The ramifications of this engagement were far-reaching. Japanese strategy in the Pacific had to adapt to a reality where Allied air superiority dictated operational choices. The last demonstrated that conventional methods of reinforcing forward positions had become obsolete, cementing air power as the primary determinant of success in the theater. Tragically, Lana's life ended on April 30, 1943, a mere 58 days after a notable period of combat when his B-25 bomber crashed during landing at Doadura. Despite having completed an impressive 87 missions without fatal incident, his survival record ended abruptly in a non-combat accident. In response to battlefield needs, North American aviation quickly adapted its production lines, incorporating field-tested armaments directly into new B-25 models. By late 1943, the B-25G and subsequent versions were rolling off assembly lines equipped with reinforced forward firepower and, in some cases, a 75mm cannon, although the cannon ultimately proved less efficient than conventional machine guns. Later models, including the B-25H, were outfitted with 14 forward-facing guns, and the B-25J could carry up to 18, establishing it among the most heavily armed aircraft deployed during the war. Beyond the technological developments, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea underscored the immense human cost of the conflict. The nearly 2,900 Japanese personnel who perished were not mere statistics. They were individuals with families, professions, and personal histories abruptly cut short. Many were conscripted civilians, formerly farmers, clerks, or students, thrust into a war they scarcely comprehended. The American crews tasked with strafing survivors also bore deep psychological scars. Long after the battle, several airmen recounted recurring nightmares about their missions, the moral weight of their actions lingering despite the strategic necessity of preventing enemy forces from reaching shore. The victory at Bismarck Sea accelerated U.S. tactical innovation. Within months, new techniques emerged, including the deployment of parachute fragmentation bombs, which enabled low-level strikes on airfields without self-inflicted damage. White phosphorus munitions were employed to mark targets, and skip bombing fuses were refined for reliability, creating an iterative cycle of battlefield-driven technological advancement. American industry had the scale and resources to support such experimentation, with material losses representing manageable setbacks. In contrast, Japan's capacity for innovation was constrained, as each failed experiment consumed scarce resources. Increasingly, Japanese strategy leaned on ideological and spiritual resolve rather than technological solutions, leading to extreme tactics such as kamikaze missions, born from the recognition that their material capabilities could not match those of the Allies. Intelligence played a pivotal role in Allied success. Units such as the Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, Frumel, and Naval Intelligence in Washington intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications, providing precise details on convoy schedules, routes, and composition. General Kenny leveraged this information to strike with optimal timing and positioning. To safeguard the secret, reconnaissance flights were carefully staged, creating the illusion that visual observation, not signals intelligence, had revealed the convoy's movements. The ruse was so effective that Japanese forces never suspected their encryption had been compromised, continuing to rely on the same codes throughout the war. The Royal Australian Air Force demonstrated the value of coordinated multinational operations. Aircraft from No. 30 Squadron and No. 22 Squadron, including Boston bombers and fighters, operated seamlessly alongside American planes, maintaining shared radio frequencies and synchronized tactics. Squadron leader William Bill Newton of No. 22 Squadron exemplified this collaborative effort, ensuring that Allied air operations achieved maximum effectiveness while minimizing confusion. The battle showcased how intelligence, tactical innovation, and international coordination could combine to deliver decisive results with profound implications both for military strategy and the human lives caught in the conflict. During the battle, a squadron of the Royal Air Force carried out 3 missions. One of its pilots, who would later be awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, demonstrated extraordinary bravery in subsequent operations before falling into Japanese captivity and ultimately being executed. The coordination between Australian and American forces highlighted a stark difference from Japanese operations, where Army and Navy units functioned almost independently, frequently competing over resources instead of working together. Behind the devastating impact of the modified B-25 bombers that obliterated the Japanese convoy lay a remarkable industrial network stretching across the United States. Each B-25 was composed of roughly 165,000 individual components manufactured in factories across numerous states. The AT-50 caliber ammunition they used came from production facilities ranging from Connecticut to California, with billions of rounds produced during the conflict. The skip bombing technique relied on specially designed delayed action fuses, mass-produced in American ordnance plants. Fuel for the extensive training exercises was drawn from oil fields in Texas and refined in Louisiana. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft were shipped from the US on a weekly basis. All of this logistical effort operated while the United States was simultaneously engaged in fighting across Europe, supplying allies like Britain and the Soviet Union, and maintaining forces throughout the Pacific theater. The convoy destroyed at the Bismarck Sea represented Japan's peak effort to reinforce its positions in New Guinea, yet the American forces that annihilated it were only a tiny fraction of the nation's total industrial and military output. American pilots assigned to this mission had already logged an average of 400 hours in the air prior to entering combat. They had undergone weeks of rigorous skip bombing training with virtually unlimited access to fuel and ammunition, dropping dozens of practice bombs before facing the enemy. In contrast, Japanese aviators in 1943 were increasingly sent into battle with less than 100 flight hours, often receiving minimal training due to severe fuel shortages. Experienced pilots who could have mentored them had mostly been killed in prior operations, victims of the massive production advantage that the United States could sustain. Consequently, new Japanese pilots were essentially novices thrown into combat against highly skilled and well-prepared American airmen. Following the disaster at Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea found themselves strategically cut off. Resupplying the front required either submarine deliveries dangerous and severely limited in capacity, or fast destroyer runs under the cover of darkness, which could not carry enough material to sustain major military campaigns. These Tokyo Express missions were able to deliver only a fraction of what had been lost with the convoy. The Japanese also resorted to moving supplies via barges along the coastline at night, only to become targets for American PT boats and radar-equipped B-25 seconds on nocturnal patrols. By June 1943, Japanese troops in New Guinea were surviving on half rations, and by September they were forced to eat grass, tree bark, and roots. The army that had once captured Singapore was now on the brink of starvation, defeated not merely through combat losses but by the systematic severing of supply lines and the overwhelming reach of air power. For a military culture steeped in centuries of samurai tradition, which revered personal valor and individual combat prowess, the scale and mechanized efficiency of the destruction at Bismarck Sea was beyond comprehension. The losses were not inflicted solely by bullets or swords, but by the relentless, industrialized might of an enemy capable of combining production, logistics, and tactical innovation on an unprecedented scale. The nature of combat in the Pacific revealed a stark clash between centuries-old warrior traditions and modern mechanized warfare. For Japanese soldiers, dying to a distant, invisible enemy offered no sense of honor. Falling victim to relentless strafing while stranded in open water did not align with the code of Bushido. This disconnect between cultural values and the realities of industrialized combat would shape the course of the war in the Pacific. Facing overwhelming firepower, Japanese forces increasingly turned to desperate measures, suicidal banzai charges, and kamikaze strikes attempts to reclaim a sense of purposeful death in the midst of mechanized destruction. In response, American forces relied on superior technology, overwhelming firepower, and industrial-scale solutions. The gap between traditional combat ethos and modern military machinery only grew wider as the war progressed. One significant technological innovation was the modification of B-25 bombers with cameras mounted in their tails. These cameras were triggered automatically when bombs were released, recording the results of attacks with extraordinary clarity. The images captured ships exploding, overturning, and burning, providing a level of documentation unprecedented in the Pacific theater. Beyond mere record-keeping, these photographs had multiple strategic uses. They allowed intelligence officers to accurately assess battle damage and confirm claims of enemy losses. They served as instructional material for future aircrews, illustrating precisely how techniques such as skip bombing performed under actual combat conditions. Additionally, these visuals became powerful propaganda, showcasing American military might to both allies and adversaries. The Japanese lacked a comparable photographic capability, relying instead on pilot debriefs, which often contained errors amid the chaos of battle. Operational conditions for the B-25 crews were grueling. Aircraft flew continuously under the oppressive heat and humidity of New Guinea, where corrosion was rampant and fine coral dust infiltrated engines. Despite these harsh conditions, mechanical failures were surprisingly uncommon. American engines were built with robustness beyond immediate requirements, incorporating reserves that allowed continued operation even under imperfect maintenance. Japanese aircraft, in contrast, increasingly suffered from inadequate upkeep. Shortages of spare parts, coupled with a lack of skilled mechanics, meant that even technically advanced engines frequently failed. Iconic fighters like the Japanese Zero were grounded more often due to maintenance deficiencies than enemy action, while American planes remained airborne on daily sorties. Communication and coordination further amplified American and Allied effectiveness. Pilots maintained constant radio contact, sharing updates on enemy positions, alerting one another to incoming fighter threats, and coordinating attack strategies. This real-time exchange of information allowed Allied aircraft to work cohesively, respond dynamically to emerging opportunities, and maximize the impact of each mission. In the broader context of the Pacific War, these technological, logistical, and organizational advantages underscored the widening disparity between traditional warrior culture and the industrialized nature of modern warfare. Japanese forces faced severe communication challenges during combat operations. Radio transmissions were sparse and often failed entirely, while available equipment proved unreliable under battlefield conditions. Coordination between different branches of the military was further hindered by the absence of standardized frequencies and poor adherence to radio protocols. As a result, ships and aircraft frequently engaged in combat independently, lacking the ability to warn one another or execute coordinated maneuvers. In contrast, American aviators entered combat with the expectation that survival after being shot down was highly probable. Their standard-issued medical kits included blood plasma, morphine, sulfur drugs, and later penicillin, ensuring immediate treatment of injuries. Air evacuation was routine, with downed personnel typically reaching well-equipped hospitals within hours. Japanese servicemen, by comparison, understood that battlefield wounds were often fatal. Medical supplies were critically low even before the loss of convoys, and essential medicines were irretrievably lost when ships sank in the Bismarck Sea. This reality had a palpable effect on morale. American pilots operated with confidence, while Japanese troops were compelled to fight with urgency and desperation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea inflicted irrecoverable losses on Japan's already overextended war machine. 8 transport vessels represented months of construction effort in shipyards operating at maximum capacity, while the destruction of their cargo supplies and ammunition constituted significant portions of resources that could not be replenished. For the United States, however, the engagement had minimal economic impact. Lost munitions were rapidly replaced from existing stockpiles, and the few aircraft downed in combat were quickly substituted. By 1943, American production lines were capable of producing roughly 100,000 planes annually, equating to almost 300 aircraft per day. Fuel expenditures during both training and combat were negligible compared to national reserves. The strategic implications of the Bismarck Sea encounter resonated throughout the remainder of the Pacific conflict. The engagement demonstrated decisively that air superiority could dominate sea lanes independently of naval forces. It also highlighted the capacity of American industrial innovation to generate new forms of warfare faster than adversaries could respond. For Japanese forces, the battle marked a turning point in the Southwest Pacific campaign. With reinforcements and supplies increasingly unattainable, Japanese units were forced into a series of desperate defensive actions, each culminating in annihilation or starvation. This shift enabled the island-hopping strategy, allowing American forces to bypass isolated garrisons that would wither without resupply. Operational lessons from Bismarck Sea accelerated the development of the B-25 bomber. The B-25G, introduced in late 1943, featured a 75mm cannon, the largest ever mounted on a twin-engine bomber. While the cannon ultimately proved less effective than multiple machine guns, its deployment reflected a willingness to experiment and adapt based on battlefield experience. Each subsequent modification incorporated lessons learned and demonstrated the industrial capacity to implement rapid changes. Post-war examination of captured Japanese documents revealed the psychological impact of the Bismarck Sea defeat. Intelligence reports emphasized the overwhelming material superiority of American forces rather than attributing success to tactical mistakes or chance, a significant departure from earlier assessments. One document noted that U.S. production capacity enabled rapid adoption of new tactics, outpacing Japan's ability to devise countermeasures. This realization of industrial inferiority represented a profound change in Japanese strategic thinking. Following the battle, the Imperial General Headquarters undertook a comprehensive review of operations in the Southwest Pacific. The assessment concluded that surface reinforcement of forward bases was no longer feasible. American air power had achieved operational dominance, and the widening industrial gap made traditional naval superiority insufficient when vessels could not survive aerial attacks. Consequently, Japanese strategy shifted toward defensive measures along the inner perimeter, a plan that assumed the pace of American offensives could be matched, an assumption that proved dangerously optimistic. Tactical innovations from the Bismarck Sea battle, particularly skip bombing, spread quickly across American forces. PBY Catalina seaplanes adopted the technique for nocturnal raids on Japanese shipping. Marine Corps pilots employed it in the Solomon Islands campaign, and even transport crews received training to employ the method if enemy vessels were encountered. This rapid dissemination was made possible by standardized training, equipment, and communication systems, allowing a technique developed in one theater to be implemented widely across multiple units within weeks. The Bismarck Sea engagement thus serves as a pivotal example of how industrial capacity, medical preparedness, and tactical innovation combined to shape the course of the Pacific War, while simultaneously exposing critical vulnerabilities in Japanese operational planning and strategic flexibility. During World War II, the Japanese military was hampered by deep divisions between its different service branches. Rivalries and poor coordination meant that even within the same operational theaters, innovations and tactical improvements were rarely shared. In stark contrast, American industrial output created conditions that rendered Japanese bravery nearly irrelevant, as vividly demonstrated during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The scale of U.S. production was staggering. American factories turned out 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers, while munitions plants produced a staggering 12 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Flight schools graduated nearly 200,000 pilots, and every B-25 component was strategically stockpiled across multiple locations in the Pacific Theater. Against such a flood of material and manpower, no level of Japanese courage could offset the arithmetic of mass production. Innovations in aerial tactics were documented meticulously by cameramen like Pappy Gunn, whose installations captured combat from angles never seen before. Careful frame-by-frame analysis revealed the optimal parameters for attack. Bombs were most effective when released from 200 to 250 feet, with aircraft approaching at roughly 245 miles per hour. This methodical, scientific approach to warfare measuring, testing, refining was distinctly American. In essence, the conflict became an engineering and logistics challenge rather than a mere contest of individual heroism. When Japanese forces lost supplies at the Bismarck Sea, the effects were immediate and severe. Frontline units quickly reported acute shortages, ammunition rationed to 10 rounds per soldier per day, rice cut to 400 grams per person, medical stores depleted, fuel unavailable, and aircraft grounded due to missing components. By contrast, American troops could afford the luxury of complaining if ice cream was not served daily. The disparity in material support was so extreme that captured Japanese soldiers often assumed American supply levels were exaggerated propaganda. The success at Bismarck Sea accelerated technological and tactical innovation in the U.S. air campaign. Within months, advances included more reliable fuses for skip bombing, deployment of napalm for widespread attacks on entrenched positions, rocket-assisted bombs for improved penetration, and white phosphorus markers to identify targets precisely. Each of these improvements relied on America's immense industrial capacity, which allowed rapid experimentation and iteration. Failed tests were affordable, costing only materials, while Japan's limited resources meant that every unsuccessful trial was a serious setback. Behind every operational B-25 was a team of maintenance personnel performing near-miraculous repairs under primitive conditions in New Guinea. Engines were overhauled in makeshift jungle workshops, battle damage was patched with whatever materials were at hand, and modifications were executed with basic hand tools. Aircraft were turned around between missions in mere hours, reflecting a level of mechanical skill cultivated by America's industrial training programs. Hundreds of thousands of Americans possessed the technical knowledge to repair engines, electrical systems, and structural components, a pool of expertise that constituted one of the nation's most potent military advantages. The controversial strafing of survivors after the battle served a strategic purpose. Japanese troops quickly learned that escaping to shore following a naval loss was often a death sentence, a psychological blow that affected morale in subsequent operations. General Douglas MacArthur described the Bismarck Sea engagement as decisive in the Southwest Pacific. While his communique may have slightly overstated Japanese losses, the operational impact was undeniable. Air power had proven capable of effectively interdicting shipping, compromising submarines and surface vessels. The defeat also directly influenced Japanese command decisions. Admiral Yamamoto, shaken by the loss, resolved to visit forward bases to restore morale, a choice that ultimately led to his death on April 18, 1943, when U.S. intelligence intercepted his itinerary and P-38 Lightnings intercepted his transport near Bougainville. The United States rapidly institutionalized the lessons learned at Bismarck Sea. Training manuals were updated within weeks to include skip bombing procedures, new pilots practiced low-level anti-shipping attacks, and tactical doctrines were revised to emphasize maritime interdiction. Every element of the battle was analyzed and documented in exhaustive reports distributed throughout the Pacific. Japanese forces, however, struggled to learn from their mistakes due to systemic issues. Inter-service rivalries and mutual blame between Army and Navy prevented honest evaluation and reform, leaving underlying vulnerabilities unaddressed. In the end, the Battle of Bismarck Sea underscored the decisive role of industrial capacity, methodical tactical innovation, and organized technical expertise. Whereas American forces could turn scientific analysis into operational advantage, Japanese efforts were limited by resource scarcity, poor coordination, and the inability to institutionalize lessons from defeat. The engagement exemplified how, in modern warfare, logistics, engineering, and innovation could decisively outweigh traditional notions of courage and warrior spirit. Initial setbacks in American air operations were often downplayed to preserve morale and avoid embarrassment, yet Japanese forces struggled to counteract evolving USOs. Bombing techniques. By the time Japan developed partial measures to defend against skip bombing tactics, American forces had already transitioned to innovative operational strategies. Field-tested modifications to the B-25 Mitchell proved so effective that they were rapidly standardized, prompting North American aviation to overhaul production lines at Kansas City and Inglewood within a matter of weeks. By the end of 1943, newly manufactured B-25 seconds emerged equipped with a range of improvements. 8 to 14 forward-firing machine guns became standard. Nose structures were reinforced to accommodate heavy armament. Engines were tuned for optimal low-altitude performance. This swift adaptation from battlefield improvisation to full-scale production demonstrated an industrial agility that Japan could not rival. Following the Bismarck Sea campaign, American bomber training incorporated low-level attack methods as a fundamental part of the curriculum. Pilots honed skip bombing skills over realistic target vessels in the Gulf of Mexico and near the Salton Sea at training facilities in Texas and Arizona. The exercises consumed immense quantities of aviation fuel, yet the United States' vast industrial capacity made such resource use sustainable. By 1943, U.S. refineries were producing approximately 1.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel annually, while Japan faced severe difficulties securing enough fuel to keep its fleet operational. Combat experience revealed the resilience of American aircraft. Several B-25 seconds returned from the Bismarck Sea mission heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire, suffering holes in control surfaces and engines. Within 3 days, all affected planes were operational again, repaired using makeshift aluminum patches, improvised engine hoists, spliced control cables, and fuel tanks patched with repurposed Japanese rubber. By contrast, similarly damaged Japanese aircraft would typically be decommissioned or scavenged for spare parts. The precision engineering behind delayed action fuses enabled skip bombing to succeed. These fuses, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, could survive high-speed water impact, endure multiple skips, and detonate at exact moments. Millions were produced in American factories, each rigorously tested. Japanese fuses, however, suffered failure rates above 20% by 1943 due to material shortages and inconsistent quality control. American crews located Japanese convoys with remarkable accuracy despite adverse weather or long distances, reflecting superior navigation training. Pilots entered combat with an average of 400 flight hours, supported by high-quality instruments, accurate compasses, detailed maps, pre-war survey charts, and meteorological forecasts capable of predicting temporary weather clearings. In contrast, Japanese navigation largely depended on visual landmarks or trailing lead aircraft, restricting operational flexibility. Intelligence played a pivotal role. American cryptographers had decoded Japanese communications, yet reconnaissance missions were deliberately staged to create the impression that visual observation had revealed enemy movements. This ruse successfully concealed the compromise of Japanese codes, ensuring the continued use of their encryption systems. At Leh, the 1,200 Japanese troops who arrived encountered a garrison already on minimal rations. Supplies intended to sustain prolonged operations had been destroyed, forcing the Japanese to forage in the surrounding jungle. Within weeks, malnutrition, tropical diseases such as malaria and dysentery, and untreated wounds devastated their units. By June 1943, illness and starvation alone had reduced the combat effectiveness of Japanese forces in Leh by approximately 60%. During the campaign over the Bismarck Sea, American aviators operated under carefully controlled combat rotations, typically completing around 50 missions or 6 months of active duty before returning home to train fresh recruits. This rotation system preserved critical combat experience and ensured that tactical lessons were continuously passed along. Experienced pilots became instructors, transmitting first-hand knowledge and refined techniques to incoming aviators. In contrast, Japanese airmen were expected to remain in combat until death. The costly expertise they accumulated disappeared the moment they were killed. By late 1943, Japan had lost the majority of its veteran pilots, and the replacements were increasingly inexperienced, facing seasoned American flyers. The clash over the Bismarck Sea illustrated the convergence of multiple American advantages. Superior technology, the industrial ability to produce modified aircraft rapidly, and a culture of field-driven innovation allowed frontline units to adapt and improve their equipment in real time. Comprehensive training programs enabled pilots to master new tactics efficiently, while intelligence networks provided precise information on enemy movements. Advanced communication systems facilitated coordination for complex assaults, and well-organized supply chains kept operations sustained. No single factor dominated the outcome. It was the synergy of these capabilities that proved decisive. The Japanese confronted not just larger numbers, but an integrated system of technological, organizational, and industrial strength they could not match. The battle itself lasted only 3 days, with the critical confrontation occurring in a brief 15-minute window on March 3, 1943. Within that short span, the dynamics of warfare in the Pacific underwent a fundamental shift. Air power demonstrated that control of sea lanes no longer required surface fleets. The American ability to innovate and adapt on the fly showed that new methods of combat could be developed and deployed faster than adversaries could counter. Industrial output confirmed that sheer quantity, when strategically applied, could be a decisive weapon. For Japan, the Bismarck Sea was more than a tactical loss. It revealed the obsolescence of their traditional military doctrine. Bravery, discipline, and adherence to martial codes proved irrelevant against B-25 bombers equipped with 8 forward-firing machine guns and capable of delivering skip bombs with scientific precision. The most elite Japanese pilots were powerless against an opponent who had industrialized warfare itself. Of the 2,890 Japanese personnel lost in the battle, many perished not merely due to bombs and bullets, but as a consequence of facing a systematized and technologically advanced form of combat for which they had no preparation. Their training had prepared them to fight skilled warriors, yet they found themselves confronting machines, methods, and organizational systems far beyond their capacity to resist. For the Americans, the engagement validated years of experimentation and improvisation. Field modifications, often created with scavenged parts and rudimentary tools, proved more effective than weapons specifically designed in laboratories. The combination of ingenuity and industrial power had created a novel mode of warfare that Japan could neither anticipate nor counter. The ramifications of the Bismarck Sea extended well beyond the Southwest Pacific. It provided definitive evidence that in contemporary conflict, industrial capability equated to military might. Nations capable of producing the largest numbers of war machines, training the greatest number of personnel, innovating the fastest, and adapting the quickest held the advantage. Traditional military virtues, valor, loyalty, sacrifice remained relevant, but they alone could not secure victory. In those 15 minutes over the Huan Gulf, 8 modified B-25 seconds achieved what the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had been unable to prevent: the destruction of a convoy that cut off critical supply lines and condemned. The brief, intense engagement made visible the culmination of years of industrial preparation. For Japanese observers, the destruction must have seemed impossible, defying everything they had known about naval combat. Yet the Americans had transformed the impossible into routine through industrial innovation, turning unthinkable strategies into standard operational practice. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as a stark lesson in modern warfare. The nation with the most efficient factories and adaptable systems could overcome even the most courageous and disciplined soldiers. Those 15 minutes did not create the victory, they revealed it, crystallizing the outcome of long-term planning, production, and innovation. From that moment onward, the rules of war in the Pacific were no longer dictated solely by individual heroism, but by the integration of industry, technology, and strategy. The Japanese realization of this reality came too late. The transformation in warfare had already sealed their fate.